Hey there you guys, Irene Lyon here. Welcome to this video. Welcome to this YouTube channel. What you have here is another one of my popular Facebook Live episodes that I do about once a month in my Healthy Nervous System Revolution Facebook group. If you're not a part of this group, the link to join is below in the Show More section. Today I cover a whole bunch of questions that were asked by my members, and what I've done is I've actually pasted those questions into the Show More section so you can see what they are, what kind of topics we are covering today. It's a very rich episode. We talk all things trauma, all things nervous system, all things neuroplasticity and healing the human system. Take care and enjoy this education. Hey there you guys, it's Irene here, Irene Lyon, and welcome to this Facebook Live Q&A. I've got questions right here. I'm just gonna dive right in after I just give you a little quick intro. So some of you might be really new to this group. Welcome to being here. If you have been here for a very long time, thank you for sticking around. I am a nervous system specialist. I'm a specialist in trauma, working with the body, working with the wirings of not just the nervous system, but how the nervous system connects to the body system, the brain, the organs, the muscles, all of it, our thinking patterns, our habits. And I do this by blending a few things. There's really three main things that I blend into my work. One is the work of Dr. Peter Levine. He's the founder of something called somatic experiencing, which is a very, very well researched, and not researched from a clinical standpoint, but in terms of trial and error and just working with thousands and thousands of people. He originally wrote the seminal book, Waking the Tiger, which really put on the map why humans get post-traumatic stress and why animals in the wild don't. And he realized back in the 70s, 60s, that we as human beings with our very complex brain, we tend to override the body's natural desire to let go of stress, to let go of traumatic stress, to come out of our fight and flight and freeze responses, something that I'll be talking about today because your questions are around these topics. So he really realized, Peter Levine, that we tend to not heal our bodies, it's not just about the brain and mental illness, but we don't heal our organ systems and our immune system and all our systems because we trap stress. And if you've been following any of the research in any of the health and wellness worlds for the last 20, 30, 40 years, it's pretty conclusive that stress and chronic stress and trapped traumatic stress makes the system sick. So I studied that, I practiced that. I also am trained in something called somatic practice, which is the work of Kathy Kane. So she's also a faculty member with Peter. She studied Peter's work, and then she's created her own branch of work. It's not better or worse, it's just a different level of working with the nervous system, specifically the stress chemistry, the stress physiology, and her work is fabulous for folks who have nervous systems that were never wired properly from the beginning. So a lot of us have stress and troubles because of stuff that happened to us when we were older, when we were children, teenagers, adults. And then a lot of us have stress and troubles and illnesses because of stuff that happened to us when we were in utero and when we were in our first 3 years of life due to usually poor attachment, misattunement from parents, trauma, surgeries, abuse, neglect, environmental stressors. There's so many things. And what we now know is that if that early wiring isn't there at the beginning, a human being is going to have a lot more troubles later in life. Even when they have a fairly good life, those wirings didn't get formed properly. And so when I work with folks who had faulty wirings from the beginning, we need to literally work to teach them how to wire back these pieces together. So it isn't so much about taking trauma out of the system in individuals with early trauma It is helping folks build a foundation and a capacity in the nervous system, in the body system, such that they can feel safe again, maybe for the first time ever. So for those of you joining right now, I'm just doing a quick rundown of my background, what I do. I've already covered the work of Peter Levine, somatic experiencing, the work of Kathy Kane, and Steve Terrell. They kind of work in combo. If you've watched there's a fabulous interview with my colleague and mentor Steve Terrell talking about kids and why they behave badly. So I posted that just last night actually in the thread, so it's something to definitely check out if you've got kids, or if you were that kid that behaved badly because of your own trauma and your own parental stresses. And then the other blend that I put in to my work is the Feldenkrais Method. So this was actually the first line of mind-body work I studied, gosh, back in 2004, 2007. Got into the work because my training as an exercise therapist, a nutrition counselor, and a fitness instructor, it wasn't cutting it. It wasn't enough. I didn't have the skills to really help people heal. And I found the Feldenkrais work because of some of my own injuries that I needed to heal. Therefore, I did that training, changed my life. But what happened was, as I started to practice, this is how I got into Peter's work, I realized that about 50% of the people I was working with weren't getting better with this really amazing process called the Feldenkrais Method. I like to call it Feldenkraisian science because it's kind of like Newtonian, Einsteinian physics or Jungian psychology. It's a body of work that doesn't have a set method really. It's a way of looking at the body, feeling into the body, tuning into the body, and then rewiring the body via movement patterns. So it's really good stuff. But as I said, it wasn't enough. Feldenkrais's work was too advanced for many of the people that had early trauma, for many of the people that had stored post-traumatic stress in their body. So I always like to do a quick review. So one thing to know is that when we have stored traumatic stress in the system and we're living in survival energy, which is like fight, flight, which is sort of like looking for danger, looking for threat, the world is a dangerous place, always on hyper alert, always, we would call it anxious, lots of high heart rate, lots of panic, so that's fight, flight. So when we live in that world due to our early traumas, and we might also live in something called the freeze or the shutdown, or being kind of numb to the environment, which is another survival protective mechanism, it's really tough to do the more advanced practices such as Feldenkrais, such as various forms of meditation, various forms of yoga and Tai Chi, and even thinking. This is why kids have trouble in school, because they're stuck in their survival physiology. This is why adults have trouble learning and remembering things and bumping into things, and troubles with just knowing who's safe and who's not, right? So when we're trapped in our stress physiology, which sadly so many are in the world, it's just the reality right now, things are tough, right? Things are really tough. So thanks for everyone that's joining. My name's Irene. If you're just chiming in here, I'm the kind of the founder and moderator of this group. And I've got questions. I printed them out. Thank you, all of you who sent in questions. I'm going to have some water. And I'm going to just kind of work through these. If I don't see a question that you pop up in the feed, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's just because I might not see it, and the feed can sometimes move quickly. But what you're gonna realize and learn as I get through these, and I'll be on for about an hour, is that a lot of these questions have the exact same answer. And this is a real hard thing to convey when we're used to having information overload and so many different techniques and methods for health and healing. We're so used to all sorts of prescriptions and medications and supplements. And what we work with here is actually quite basic, and yet it's so unknown as a generalization right now. It's so unknown because we sometimes don't believe simple exists when it comes to health and wellness, but it does. So the first question that was posted yesterday is, I'm just going to grab one thing that I need to have to answer this question. It's my toy. So the question is from, I'm going to try to pronounce this, is it Ghislaine Sicard? Asks, hi Irene, I wonder if you can explain what maintains one in a state of freeze, and why Peter Levine recommends the importance to unfreeze slowly. So this is a great question. So quick review, as I mentioned, freeze or shut down, we've got fight, flight, freeze. Freeze is where we go. So I always use my fingers when I'm teaching. So we have a stress, a traumatic event, a threat, could be all sorts of things. Our system goes into an arousal. This is just what happens. It has to. So it goes into a response, a stress response, sympathetic, adrenal energy, fight, flight. It orients what's wrong, what's going on. And then if the system senses that I can't get out of this threat, or this threat isn't going to go anywhere, what occurs is the system goes into what we call a freeze response. Now, there are subtleties along the freeze mechanism. There's pure, full-on shutdown where a person just passes out. In the animal world, we often call something, there's a term called playing possum. Not sure if anybody's ever heard that, but that's where these little possum mammals, if you just Google it on the internet, you'll find them all. Don't go yet, but later, do that. And a possum will encounter a dog or a wolf or a child, often walking up to it, and it'll just literally, right, go into a shutdown response, a freeze response, and they're like stiff. They're not dead. What they go into is like a little hibernation stage. The organs basically draw all the blood. They go into protection. Now, humans, we have this capacity, thank goodness. So if we have a broken leg or a car accident, going into shock is also this freeze response. It gives us the chemicals we need to not feel pain, our opioids. It puts us into this sort of slow state, and it helps us survive. Now, if a person was born with really good attachment, really good nurturing, everything was actually, let's just say, pretty perfect upbringing. And I know it might be hard for many of us to understand that, but this does happen. So let's say that person has a pretty good, solid wiring of their nervous system from early on. I talked about this about 10 minutes ago. If they might have a car accident, let's say, they'll go into shock. Because that person's capacity is already pretty big and robust, and their nervous system is quite resilient, chances are they'll come out of that shock and freeze pretty easily. It might not be shaking, it might be tears, it might be just connecting with a parent or a spouse or the nurse or the doctor or the paramedic, and it allows them to come out of that shock state. However, not everybody has the luxury of an early upbringing that was secure and solid, where there were lots of good foundations laid in the nervous system, and they learned how to let go of stress gradually as they got into more stressful situations, which is how we hope humans are raised, right? You don't want to take a little baby and expose it to tons of stress. Little bits of stress and little bits and little bits, and then as they get older, they go to school, more stress, they have homework, but because they've layered their system slowly over time, they can take on more stress and more stress and more stress. But when that wasn't there, that same person has a car accident, their system goes into shutdown and freeze, and the system, for lack of a better word, goes into chaos because it doesn't know how to cope with this crazy, crazy, chaotic fight, flight, and shutdown energy, even though it's had a lot of experience with that. It's kind of like the car accident. I know I'm using an example here, hypothetical, but it's like the car accident is the straw that broke the camel's back. And I've worked with people who have come to me after a car accident and no one knows what to do with them because all they had was a simple car accident and they weren't hurt. It was a fender bender and they've been on disability. They've been in pain. They've had panic and all these things. And so why a person needs to come out of freeze slowly, this is what the original question is that if we have a system, so now I'm going to bring out my toy. So this is a really fun toy. Kids, well, adults love it too. It's called a Hoberman sphere, but it just gets really big and really small. So when we're born, we want to learn and become good at having a resilient system that can ebb and flow, expand and contract, get stress, come out of stress, right? We need this homeostasis to survive. It's the pumping of the heart, the movement of our digestion, flow of our blood, all these things. So when we've, so I'm going to go back. If we've had a really good upbringing and we're like this most of the time, and we might get really stressed and get really expanded, or we might get really close to being shut down, but then we come out of it, right? You have that accident and the system goes really quickly. But then because it has the knowledge, the self-knowledge to come out of that shutdown, that shock, it'll slowly start to come out naturally, right? So this is the individual that had the good upbringing. The reason I'm taking time to explain this is because this is going to facilitate the other questions that I've got. So you have then someone who is in shutdown and freeze, let's say due to a car accident, because they never got that good resiliency when they were young. And the system goes like this. It just shuts right down. The reason we want to come out of this freeze slowly is if we try to open it up too quick, it's going to feel real scary and it's going to feel really intense. Flashbacks might happen that cannot be processed, memories, body sensations, fear is going to be at a high, all-time high. And what happens is that if a person comes out of shutdown or freeze too quickly and they're like this, and then they start to feel all this stuff, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to go back into a shutdown and even more shutdown state, like smaller than this. But what's contained in that is all that survival energy. The fight flight is under the freeze. This is a really important thing to know. So, Gilan, I hope that answers the question. We need to come out of freeze slowly because we don't want the system to, for lack of a better word, blow up. My awesome mentor Kathy uses that term often, so I steal that from her. We don't want the system to go, right? We want it to slowly open so that with each opening, the person's psyche and body can register the change, digest it, integrate it, and go, okay, now I can stay rather than here. Now I can stay here. Okay, and then I'm going to poke the system with a little bit more work, somatic work, to open it up a little bit, bring a little more feeling on board. Maybe we process one of the memories, just one of them, and then with that we open up the system a bit more, but then we want it to stabilize. And what is really one of the hardest things to convey when people decide to really do this work and work at this level of the physiology, the somatic body, and these nervous system responses is we want to go from 0 to 100 really quick because we've been so unwell for so long. We're fed up. We don't want to keep doing this. Nothing's worked. And then when I work with folks and I'm like, we're just going to sit here and feel your feet, right? Or we're just going to look around and you tell me what happens when you see that blue sky in the clouds. I'm looking at the sky right now. And it might seem painfully slow, but when we've had not good wiring from the beginning and traumatic events later in life, we need to treat the system with caution, curious caution. We need to be able to be curious and interested in what's going on, but we also don't want to overload it. And all too often I see people trying to do as much as they can, and they overload the system, and then they get worse, because what occurs is that nice flow that I was talking to you about, as this becomes better, not only does the flow be felt in the system, but it impacts everything else, the immune system, the hormones, the digestion, everything. And so we need to be able to bring this back slowly, because if it then clamps down really tightly again, then what is impacted? The digestion, the immune system, the heart, everything, the muscles. So we want to take it slow and easy. All right, I'm going to have a sip of some liquid. Thank you for all 32 of you that are here. I appreciate it. If you're tuning in right now, I'm just working through some questions that people posted yesterday. At the beginning of this, I go over a little review of who I am and what I do. So if you're new to this group, be sure to check that out afterwards. All right, this is a question from Annette. She asks, how can we regulate our nervous system so that we don't get automatic fight or flight responses when thinking of a person that we had a stressful or intense event with? Or what can we do at that moment when replaying stressful, exciting events with someone in our mind that caused us anxiety? I get a feeling of my stomach dropping or nervous butterflies when I think of or interact with people in my life. I've tried so much to avoid these stresses to certain people I want to interact with. Instead, I've chosen to avoid these people in order to avoid the anxiety, but I don't want to live a life of seclusion in order to protect my nervous system. All right, so this is a great question. I wish my husband was here to answer this. I'm going to answer it, obviously, but he's a great example of this, Annette. When I met him, he was secluded in the woods. I met him at a retreat resort in Oregon. He was working there as a cook, and he has got a very, very high level of early trauma. And so living in a secluded, off-grid, small community where there were really very little responsibilities other than showing up at work. You know, there's no cell phone. At that time, no internet in the homes. It's changed now. Things were very easy. And yet, he also knew deep down that if he was to stay there, because he had anxiety, he would probably end up getting sick and die quite young. So when I met him, he often jokes that I rescued him and brought him into the real world, where then the real work began, because he had to engage with people and strangers and environments and get a job and all these things that were really uncomfortable. But like I just said in the first answer, it had to happen slowly. Now, the interesting thing is that my sense is that from what you write here, there's probably, I don't want to assume, but I'm going to make a quick assumption that there was early trauma, maybe misattunement in your early upbringing. And I actually want to read a quote, if you don't mind, from, this is a Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a really good read. It's thick. But there's a reason why I'm going to read this. So, as we grow up, we gradually learn to take care of ourselves, both physically and emotionally. But we get our first lessons in self-care from the way that we are cared for. Mastering the skill of self-regulation depends, to a large degree, on how harmonious our early interactions with our caregivers are. Children whose parents are reliable sources of comfort and strength have a lifetime advantage, a kind of buffer against the worst that fate can hand them. So this says it all. And so when I hear questions where there's this stress and social anxiety, and when a thought comes, there's immediate fight, flight. At the beginning, I talked about the need for us to have strong connections, which is just what Bessel talked about in that paragraph. With those strong connections, we can take on a lot of stress. We feel the stress, and we kind of, when we have this capacity, the best word I can say is we kind of we digest it, we integrate it, and then it literally disappears. And when this doesn't happen, it's a good indication that the system has a very small capacity for stress. And so it's not going to build if we aren't challenging ourselves and working with these capacities and body systems to make, literally, I call them the swimming pool, bigger. This is something that I actually, Annette, cover in a healing trauma video series. The reason I'm mentioning it is it's going to happen in just over a month. Starts on September 27th. We don't have the registration open yet, at least I don't think we do. Erin can let you know, she's online right now. But I really want to make sure that you watch those videos, because the first video, I'll give you a quick rundown. It talks about how if we have a pool that's really small, so that's the capacity of our body, we can only fit so many beach balls into that pool. And the beach balls represent the stress, right? The triggers, all these things. We need to grow the capacity of the body so that those same stresses have more room and more space. One of the reasons we feel anxiety and we can't work with it is because our capacity literally in our physical system to bring in that stress isn't there. So it feels horrifying, it feels terrorizing, feels terrible, because it feels like our entire system is swallowed up by that stress, by that anxiety, by that threat, by that thought. And really what's happening is that the capacity is small, so we need to build the capacity of the nervous system, the body system, the self-sensing system, and then we need to learn how to take the stresses out. So if there were specific traumas, so for yourself, was there or were there relational traumas, wounds, whether early in life or with people, workers, school, bullies, spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, altercations with a stranger, things in your life that caused this kind of social anxiety. I know for my husband, because I don't know your personal experience, but I'll give you his, and I have permission to talk about this. His anxiety, and he had complex PTSD when I met him, which was kind of contained because he was living in this non-stressful environment. But inside of his system was this pot of huge, huge post-traumatic stress that wasn't being worked with. It was just kind of it was like in hibernation. So his early relationships were with a very, very angry and controlling father. There was physical abuse, there was tons of emotional abuse, there was tons of toxic shame. So toxic shame is the type of shame where you're basically telling a person that they're not good at anything, they're never going to amount to anything in life, they're stupid, they're an idiot, these sorts of things. So when you have that early upbringing of toxicity, your desire and your safety, not just around the father or the mother or the babysitter or whoever might have done that to you, it's not just that person, it's going to be every other person. Every single person in the world is going to feel unsafe. And what happens is that when you're that young and you have that experience of the world being a dangerous place in the face of your primary relationship, the world then is a dangerous place. And so what then we do is we seclude ourselves, we don't go out. This is where agoraphobia starts, is just because that little being believes, and the cells know that the world is a dangerous place. The cognition might think otherwise, but the cellular system is saying the world's not safe. So to work with this, first of all, education is key. Second of all, building the capacity of the system through somatic practice. So this is the work that I've developed. Some people have some questions here about my 12-week program, which I'll get to. But the way that we want to build the capacity in the body is to bring our focus and attention to the body and learn how to listen to it, learn how to follow its impulses, learn how to trust it, and listen to these anxieties, which are really sensations. So when these sensations come up, my suggestion to you, Annette, is to feel them, notice them, even talk to them, see if they have anything to say. They may not. Typically when a sensation and an anxiety and a terror or a fear was trapped in the system from really early, so before we could talk, there are no words that come. It's pre-verbal. So all there is this terrifying sense of doom and like I said, the world is a dangerous place. So we need to know that the people, granted the people aren't harming you, right? So I'm going to make that assumption. Say it's just the checkout lady at the store and being interacted with her and she's not doing anything wrong is causing anxiety. When that happens, it's not because of the person, it's because of your internal physiology is being triggered by a relational interaction. And so with that, we have to remember that we can't avoid the anxiety. The anxiety will live in us until we confront it and work with it. So again, education, building capacity in the system. This is what I teach in my programs. Probably from what I've seen, one of the best programs to bring you through step by step how to be with the body and work with the body. It takes work. It's not, a flash of a wand. It takes time. For some people, it takes years to rebuild their capacity and build the space in their system to feel these things. But when it's done methodically and slowly, it happens. And then on top of that is seeking out some work with someone who does the work that I do, which is the two, somatic experiencing and somatic practice. Especially if this is early trauma, you want to do some work with someone who's trained in Kathy Kane's work. All right. Casey has a question. Hey, Casey, which I'm going to read, but my answer is not going to be very full because I would need to have more information. She says, when I'm triggered by my baby's daddy, so I'm assuming that's your partner, so your child's father, with whom I live, I can just explode with fury and grief. I'm wondering what I can do to not be such a loose cannon, or is being a loose cannon a healthy part of coming out of shutdown with big current stressors? I feel maybe it would be more productive if not such an instant reaction. I'm present for the buildup of tension, but the top blowing off, I feel like I'm watching from the outside. So it's very possible, Casey, that you're coming out of a shutdown. And I guess the thing that I would ask, of course, is that we need to make sure that the primary relationship we have is technically safe. I'm going to use myself as an example again. So I was talking about my husband, Seth, who had horrible early trauma, lots of complex PTSD and anxiety. For about the first, we've been together 7 years, for about the first 6 years, believe it or not, I was still a dangerous person. I was a better person than most, but his physiology still felt that I was a threat. And I wasn't, I mean, I'm not always perfect, but I wasn't an actual threat to his safety. But his underlying physiology and system had a little bit of that. Like it was not that big, but still there. And so we have to make sure, and yet, of course, like our relationship is it's not abusive. If it was, that would be a different situation. So I will assume that there is no abuse within this relationship. Therefore, if you are blowing up like this, it's possible that this is early, like you even said here, fury and grief. Fury is kind of like, that's a kid having a tantrum. That, you know, when you write that word, to me, fury is like absolute, like, I can't handle this anymore. No one is listening to me. I'm here, mom's there, but no one's listening to me. No one is seeing me. No one is feeling me. This is what leads children to have like blow-ups. But what happens is the child realizes that blowing up isn't going to get them what they need, and they're going to get more shut out. What does that child do? They shut down. Actually, I talk about this in my article, Anger is Medicine. If you read the vignette that I talk about, where I witnessed a little girl being shut down when she needed connection, that's a good example. When I think of that little girl that was having this tantrum, she was in true fury and grief, and then she shut down. So trapped in that little tiny nervous system is a bomb waiting to go off. And so it could be, Casey, that because you've been working with me throughout the last, 5 months or so, through the program, there's just more freezes coming up to the surface and bubbling out. I will maybe suggest that if you can really track yourself and what is occurring right before the blow up happens, and to stay connected, and then to, of course, demand that your partner stay connected with you when you blow up. That's one of the most important things for the repair to happen. Again, I'm making a lot of generalizations, but if there is an early attachment rupture that your system is looking to heal with your dude, and he's keen to play with this with you to help you. This is where a healthy relationship, when both parties can understand the nervous system and what these things are, it's better than any therapy, because you're with your primary relationship figure and you're working to resolve those internal things that were never met when you were little. And it can be really scary, because when a big person lets out that fury of a toddler, it's going to be a little bigger because we're bigger, right? And just know that if you've got someone safe that you can express this with, it might actually really shift things. So, oh, and then the other thing you say, but I'm watching from the outside. So, exactly. So what happens is when that blow up happens, your system is dissociating, which kids do. When they can't be met and they have so much intensity, they will dissociate. And then this is where we get learning problems, because they're not in their brain. So work with it. See if you can track and trace and slow it down. And when, let's just say you do find yourself watching from the outside, if your partner is there, which I think they probably are, have like a pact that when that happens, that it's okay for them to come and like touch and like connect with you, so that you can come back into the fury and the grief. And my sense is that under that fury and grief is going to be maybe some sadness. All right. Okay, Sarah has a question. Yes, that thing is called the Hoberman sphere. And hello, Dika. Good to see you. Sarah has a question. This question might be a bit to your past life as a physical rehab pro and patient, but I would like to know your thoughts on whether it's possible to have basically a well-regulated global nervous system, but have local freeze in previously injured areas. Yes. Yes, and actually I just experienced something like this myself, so I'll share that. You ask, I'm trying to figure out if my hip has nerve damage or if there's trapped somatic trauma issues, or both. Or maybe as far as neuroplastic healing goes, it's 6 of 1/2 dozen or the other. Yeah, good point. Is the healing approach basically the same anyway? I found some trapped movement patterns and vague emotions come up when I managed to activate it a little, but they are so non-specific. This is common that they'll not be specific. It's not like some other trauma work I've ever done before. Very interested in your thoughts. So yes, you can have a very regulated nervous system and have shut down and freeze in specific areas of the body. This is where it gets a little more complex, but I'm a good example of that. I had the good early wiring, but I also had a lot of chemical trauma growing up. I had a lot of physical trauma, a lot of impact trauma, and a lot of surgeries. And some transgenerational trauma on both sides, but mainly my mother, because she grew up in a very war-torn country in the Philippines. So that kind of lingers in the DNA of children who are born to parents who were in these kinds of circumstances. But by the by, I had a good regulated nervous system, and I also had some severe shutdown and freeze in my knee joints because of the multiple surgeries. Interestingly enough, I haven't written about this yet, but about 3 weeks ago, I was processing some real deep evil and anger and goodness. This is what inspired the article that I just wrote called The Importance of Feeling Good and Evil for Healing Trauma. So be sure to read that. So this is what inspired that post, even though I don't talk about this experience. So I had a really bad sore throat, cold, which really wasn't a cold or a sore throat. It was something moving through me energetically, I'm pretty sure. I tapped into some really deep evil stuff, not like my evil stuff, but the world. So there's a lot of shit going down in the world right now, and I feel all of it. I believe all of us are empaths, and all of us are sensitive to this energy that's in the earth, that's happening right now in humanity. And I was processing it deeply, but at the same time, what's really important when we're processing deep, deep trauma and pain is that we have to feel the goodness at the same time. So this happened, had a big cry, lots of screaming. My husband was helping me do this. And then I went to bed, but I didn't go to bed because then I started to feel like mosquitoes were biting me all over my body, but they weren't. There were no mosquitoes in the room. And I couldn't sleep. My sympathetic system got totally spiked, and literally it was like lightning all over my body. I stood up, I started to walk on the spot, and then all of a sudden it felt like I was being bitten by a hornet's nest on both of my kneecaps. And then proceeded for the next 3 hours, massive hives came out of both my knee joints, but specifically around the incisions of the knee that had been operated on 5 times. I have the pictures, but they're on the phone that I'm talking into, so I can't show you them. But I watched this freeze and shutdown in my knee joints come out in the form of these hives. They weren't itchy, they weren't painful. They just literally, it's like evil was bubbling out of my system. They came up, and then by the time, this was at 3 in the morning, by the time the sun came up, everything was gone. Now the interesting thing about this, Sarah, is that I then went away for a week and went hiking, and I hike and exercise quite a lot, but often my knee gets a bit stiff, a bit swollen, which makes sense because there's a bit of arthritis in there. Nothing. I even went for a 20-kilometer hike last weekend with my dad and husband. No swelling, no pain, other than being tired and my feet being a bit sore, but nothing. The other interesting thing, I got bit by mosquitoes because it was so mosquito infested, and normally when I get bit by mosquitoes, they welt up. The mosquito bites didn't get red. There was just a little, like you could see the prick, and they went away. It's still boggling my mind. So, yes, there can be trauma in a body part because of a shock trauma, which is a surgery or an injury, but the whole system can be regulated. And then there's some people that we meet where they may have a dysregulated system, and some parts of their body are on shutdown, and some parts of their body are in sympathetic arousal. This is why doing this work can't be done in a step-by-step fashion. And this is why I am so passionate about teaching people these stories and the theory and building that capacity in the nervous system so that their systems have more space, so they have the capacity to be with whatever might come up. There's no way in heck I could have predicted that me processing deep, deep, deep evil and good at the same time would cause something that occurred 20 years ago, because I had my last and final surgery was in 2000, so let's say 17 years ago. There's no way I could have predicted that. So I hope, good, I'm glad you like the story. Okay, here's the other thing. You say, this is really important, and again, this is so hard to convey. You say, I've not had hives, but occasional redness. I have a history of skin problems. So my genetic predisposition is to get rashes. So if I'm stressed, I'll get a little bit of eczema. If I eat something that maybe doesn't agree with me, I'll feel it. That's my genetic predisposition. It does not mean that that is what a person goes through to release freeze in a body part. Someone might have, you mentioned a hip, you may get tears from feeling your hip, like crying. You might get a deep, deep pain that you have to feel. It might be cooling. It might get hot. There might be a desire to shake, right? We always think that shaking is what has to happen for us to heal trauma. And this is where I respect David Berceli's work, trauma release, but what has happened with this form of work, right? I respect his study and what he's done with people to help them. And yet what it's done is it's made a lot of people think to release trauma, I have to shake. Because of, if I come back to me, my form of chemical trauma, I was exposed in utero to age 20 with a lot of chemicals. And then these surgeries, I've never shook involuntarily. Never. I've had skin reactions. I've had panic that comes and goes, that is old early trauma. And that's how my system processes. So everyone's going to be different. And I have to, how can I make that more clear? I don't know if I can make it any more clear than that. We have to learn to listen to ourselves, and then when things come up and out, granted you're okay, right? Granted you're okay and you feel safe feeling stuff, then anything can be possible, right? And then sometimes we get injuries and illnesses to help us process early trauma that has nothing to do with that illness or injury. So again, one kind of hypothetical, say an adult human being was that poor kid that was never allowed to be sick when they were young. They were still forced to go to school, no matter how, unless they were on, death's door, were they allowed to stay home. And then they end up getting sick, real sick, as say an adult, and how they proceed with that illness is going to give them the opportunity to either heal or not heal, right? These days, not all illness diagnoses are a life sentence. Things like cancer, you hear of people who get cancer and they then all of a sudden decide, I'm changing my life, right? Anita Muraji has a great book called Dying to Be Me, where she has a miraculous healing remission from horrific cancer. And it was due to a choice. It was a near-death experience choice, but her system realized it had to go a certain path. So we're given these opportunities, I believe, in life to heal the stuff that was never given to us when we were, say, young, like this example of a little kid that was never allowed to be sick. That's setting up a person to probably get sick later in life so that they then can learn what it's like to be sick, feel being sick, and be taken care of and take time off. Okay. Carolyn asks, I'm just trying to work out how you unfreeze without massively triggering, oh, I read that wrong. I'm just trying to work out how you unfreeze without triggering massive flashbacks and past traumas. So Caroline, if you're listening to this, I hope you've been listening to this from the beginning, because I explained this already a little bit, so make sure that you go back if you've just joined. So here's the interesting thing. We actually, having memories of our past trauma isn't the bad thing. We need to sometimes tap into images, time points, memories as they come, or as me as a therapist, when I work with someone, if we're kind of stuck in an area and I know they had a car accident and it's just not coming out, I'm going to ask them about that accident. But I'm going to ask them about it, and then I'm going to pause and go, okay, now that we've just talked about the time of year that this accident happened, let's say it was during a snowstorm, I'm going to say, okay, just pause and feel what's happening in your body as you notice or think of that snowstorm. Just come back to the body, and they may all of a sudden sense that they're tight, right? That everything just clamps up. So that is the tiniest amount of memory that I want a person to work with. But then we go back, we like literally thread back to the body and feel what's happening. And then we might not ever go back to that memory, that session. We might wait for 2 more sessions to go back and just work on this sense of terror and fear from that image of being in the snowstorm. Okay. What happens is that we sometimes get flashbacks that are like a lightning bolt. It's so intense, and it literally re-traumatizes us. It comes back to this capacity that we have. I made the example of a swimming pool, in that if we don't have a big enough capacity in our system, that shock memory is going to come into our body, and it's going to feel like the world is going to end. And it usually isn't going to end, but because there's not enough capacity to absorb that memory, and we don't have the capacity to be with our body, connect to the environment, feel ourselves in relationship to the environment, feel our breath, know that we're okay, these flashbacks will then become a triggering event, right? So you have to unfreeze and work on these traumas with everything I've already said before, which is building capacity, getting more education, and then if need be, working with a trained professional who understands survival physiology, trauma, and the nervous system, and the importance of going slow. The caveat to that is if I go back to when I was talking about early trauma, if this person didn't have the proper wiring from the beginning, and they have, say, chronic fatigue, which is very common in many of my clients, before we even work with the trauma, so here's that capacity again, there's often no juice in the system. So I've got water here, right? There's often no juice in the system. So before we even work on the specific traumas, we have to fill the system up with juice. In other words, we need to plump it up and give it a bit more resiliency, a little more positive know-how. We need to give it time to rest, bring back safety, so that the system actually has stores of energy so that it can then mount the appropriate fight-flight reaction that needs to happen to then come out of freeze. I know I just kind of did a huge loop there, but one of the things that often occurs when someone has had early trauma and then they have a shock trauma, so an accident, like keep using the car accident example, is that they may go to a classically trained SE, somatic experiencing practitioner. That's one of the things I'm trained in. And they try to work on the event of the car accident, but the person just can't. They can't allow the anxiety to be felt. They can't allow the fear to be felt. They just shut down. This then is an indication that they need to do more foundational work. right? They need to lay the foundation, lay the cement, lay the things that you need so that, you know, if we use the analogy of a house, that house can be strong. We need to build foundation first before we can do the fancy trauma work. And then that's what I teach in my 12-week program. It's what someone would do with you if you go and see them for somatic practice touch work. That's the work of Kathy Kane. Most people that are trained in Kathy's work are also somatic experiencing practitioners. That's what I have training in, are those two main modalities. So again, this is why there's no recipe where you do this and then you do this. As a person, as a human being, if you're watching this and you really want to do this work, it's super important to get the education and the knowledge on board to what it is your system needs. Because I have seen people do somatic experiencing work and it's been way too much for their system, way too much. And they've actually had more benefit by going through the online work I've put together, because it can be done in little tiny bits, little tiny chunks at their own pace. When you go and work with someone one-on-one, I was just talking to a colleague about this yesterday. We're in a bit of a conundrum right now because the way that therapy works is you book an hour, you pay for an hour, you have to use that hour. And for a therapist to make a living, they also have to bill that way, right? It would be really tough if a therapist has a week where their clients come in and all their clients only need is 10 minutes and they charge accordingly. And so we're in this weird, tricky situation where the type of work that we need to do with human beings isn't lined up with the classic way of going to see a practitioner. Now, some of my colleagues have the luxury of not needing to bring in a big living, because say they have maybe spouses or savings or whatever. And so someone will come in and they'll say, you know what, I think this is enough after say 10 minutes of work or 15 minutes of work. And then they just allow the person to sleep in the room for the rest of the hour, right? Some might say that that's not being effective, but it actually is. If you do, Karen says here, baby steps. Yeah, if you do a little piece of work and the system gulps it in, digests it, and we get a little bit of regulation on board into the nervous system, we want to stop and not go further. So this then comes into the next question beautifully. I did not plan this. Sophia Anika Bio asks, can you talk about who your program is for? So I'm assuming you mean my 12-week program, and if it would benefit someone with borderline personality. So borderline is basically developmental trauma. It's attachment rupture. If you read this book that I quoted earlier, Bessel's book, The Body Keeps the Score, he and even Gabor Mate, all these people, Peter, with the exception of some very small percentages in the population where there's true genetic defects, most mental illness classifications, when you look at them deeply, it all comes down to that early attachment, rupture, poor bonding, traumatic events, and typically the parent, the mother, being unwell herself, being sick, being not able to attune and connect. So the program that I have, it's 12 weeks. It starts October 17th. And I just mentioned the importance of going slow, Sophia, and going really, really, really small. Now, I have seen all sorts of folks go through this. I've seen my colleagues who are fairly well and regulated go through this and have really good insight. I've had brand newbies who have never done anything go through this and learn so much. I've had people that have very, very early attachment trauma go through this with success, people that have had shock traumas, you name it. And what I've seen is it comes down to a few things. The people that really benefit are the ones who know that they have to do the work and that they take their time and they listen to when they stop or need to stop. So even though I have it set in a curriculum that's 12 weeks, which I just have to do, because if I didn't, then it would just be indefinite, a person must go through it at their own pace. And there are some people in the program who have been working through the modules, I call them labs, for 2 years. I'm thinking about Naya, a lovely lady who lives in Australia, who has struggled with a lot of chronic fatigue. She's talked about her experiences in this group, and she just does the tiniest little bit, tiny, 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 but with the tiny baby drops that are certain and done with intention and attention and listening and honoring to the body's impulses, she has been able to go from some pretty significant chronic fatigue, not being able to leave the house, to traveling with her husband in a motorhome through Australia. So it's amazing to me, because I know in my heart, based on seeing my students and based on seeing the people that haven't had as much success, because not everyone's going to resonate with the work. There needs to be a desire to have a little bit of what's the word? You have to be a bit of a self-starter, right? We guide you a lot. Yeah, Dika just mentioned in here, I think your work is more helpful for borderline personality than therapy, as it's too triggering. Exactly. And the reason why, it's not because this work is a miracle thing. It's not magic. It's just what the system needs. It's what the system needs. It does not mean that I don't advocate for acupuncture or massage or good eating or, Reiki therapy or osteopathy. All these things I'm very much for. But if we don't have this structure of being able to listen to our somatic physiology, understand what our stress responses are, how stress gets trapped in the system, how we might have very little capacity in our body system, if we can understand that, then what happens is we just throw, kind of like a firing squad, we throw all these treatments to a system that is so stressed and strained, and the person doesn't even know what's happening because they have no internal compass. The only internal compass that they have typically is fear and anxiety and pain and fatigue and flashbacks. And we need to replace those primary focuses to another part. And this is why I believe, again, I'm new in this work, and I'm only in my early 40s, so I'm still young in my career when I look at, say, Peter, who's in his 70s. But in studying with him and looking at what I've developed, Sophia and everyone here, and I've looked at what Peter's developed and how his work just has revolutionized how we heal trauma, what's happening is that our attention gets funneled when we've had trauma, when we've had pain for so long. All we see is one thing. The brain is occupied with just pain and just fear and terror. And so we want to physically, I'm trying to go into the brain. We need to go into the brain and replace all the sections of the brain that register pain and fear and terror with something else. And so in the 12 weeks, in the work, even in the 21-day tune-up that I do, that's like a little curated piece out of the 12 weeks, we're replacing these patterns with something else. So all of my neurosensory exercises focus on something in the body, whether it's your posture and feeling yourself on your feet, whether it's touch of various parts of the body, whether it's noticing your breath in very specific ways. I don't do breathing exercises per se, but we work in a very Feldenkraisian way to build more capacity in the lungs and in the ribs and in the spine and in the sternum and in the shoulders and the hips. And then there's lots of education. And I've really seen that when people get the education on board, a few things happen. One, they don't feel crazy because they get answers for why their system hasn't been getting healed, even though they've been doing so much stuff. And then it starts to, because we're such cerebral creatures and we're smart, we need an explanation. it's not enough to just go sit on a table and be treated by someone, because we can check out, right? And if that person that we're working with can't have a dialogue with us about what's going on in our body, we're not helping the body in good relationship. So a lot of the ways that we treat is just very passive, and it needs to become more active. Becky asks, would you say that you are aligned with Peter Levine or Gabor Mate or another person's work? I combine them. So Becky, I've been trained, my first training was in exercise science, nutritional science, biomedical science. I did research. Then I studied the Feldenkrais work at probably one of the highest levels in the world. I'm top of my game in that work. And then I studied Peter's work. I would say that I'm top of my game in that work. And then I studied Kathy Kane's work, which is somatic practice. And again, I'm top, I'm in the top percentage of people that have all these. Not many people have all those together. I can count on my hand the amount of people that have Feldenkrais, Levine, and Kathy Kane's work. And then Gabor Mate doesn't really have a body of work. He's an intellectual, he's a physician, so he's great for theory, and he's so well read and eloquent at speaking, but he actually doesn't have a body of work himself that he's put together. So I've combined everything. And then I've just always had a knack for teaching this stuff. It's hard to explain, but that's what this 12-week course is all about. Cindy asked if this can help with people with epilepsy. Here's the thing. This will help. I know this seems far-fetched, but it will help any human being who wants to grow more capacity in their system. Will this help someone cure a disease? I can't answer that. I've seen clients who have had epilepsy stop having seizures. That does not mean that person X or Y will have that same effect. But my husband's worked with some little kids who have had severe seizures and epilepsies due to early trauma, and they no longer have epilepsy. It's really, I don't even like to use the term epilepsy. I would say seizures. Yes, this work can heal transgenerational trauma. Here's the thing. The system that we have is our system. How it is responding based on all of our environmental factors, but also our imprinted physiology that we get from our interactions with the environment, but also how we were, I like to say the word cooked in mom, how we were, in utero for 9 months, how we were gestated. We are so complex. You can't even speak the words to convey, because we say mind, body, environment connection, but it's just all one. And the DNA is in there, our memories are in there, the hints of our past lives are in there. I believe in past life trauma as well, deeply. If you want to read about that, read Brian Weiss's books, Many Lives, Many Masters. Fabulous psychiatrist who stumbled across the importance of doing past life work. But the thing is that all these past things are in our current system, right? So when we work with the current system, and maybe while we're working on, say, I'm going to make a hypothetical, are building more capacity in our upper body, feeling our arms, all of a sudden we have a memory of being like strapped with a belt or something, or being held captive, or being on a beautiful boat in the middle of the Caribbean and you've never been to the Caribbean, right? If memories like this come up, it's really important to take them at face value. The first thing someone will say to me when I'm working with them and they have a very strange thought or memory, they'll say this without a doubt: this is going to sound really strange, but, and then they'll tell me what they just felt or remembered, and I'll be like, awesome. I don't question it. Kind of like a child. When a child has this imaginary world, the worst thing we can do is say, that's not possible. You have to go with it, right? You have to say, wow, well, tell me about it. Because our system, our somatic body, our cells, they have intelligence in them, and we kind of slap them down, because often that's what happened to us when we were young, is the parental unit that existed from like a lot of time didn't accept these creations and the creativity and the ingenuity and the smartness that is in our physiology. Tribal cultures do, right? Cultures that understand soul and connection to the universe and the land and nurturing the land and the person, they understand these deeper soul retrieval elements and very shamanic kind of medicine. Peter is highly into shamanic medicine, as is Gabor Mate, as are a lot of these top experts. And it's because you get to a certain point where you see enough trauma and you work with enough people to know that there's more there than just what meets the eye. So I really do believe that we can get into not just our current life trauma, but the deep, deep initial traumas of the world when we do the work on us, because we're the seeds of this entire universe, right? So, and I know I say this, but when you do the tiniest bit of emotional work, the tiniest bit of somatic work, it is influencing the entire cosmos. You're taking out stress of one system that contributes to the whole. Please know that, right? I have a lot of students that get down on themselves when, oh, all I can do is just feel my feet when I feel stress. I'm like, that's great. At least you can feel something, right? That lets you know that you're alive. But we've been conditioned and brainwashed that little isn't enough, that it needs to be extravagant and big. You know, I mentioned a second ago or 30 minutes ago that we have this romantic notion that to heal trauma we have to shake. Doesn't mean I've never shook in my life, except for when I've come out of an anesthetic, right, when you're shivering. So we need to understand everyone's individual, everyone's unique. Yes. Erica, I have constant nightmares of past life, I believe. I've tried to release it, but it's not working. Will your 12-week course be helpful? Yes. I pretty much, I mean, I'm a big believer in this program. Obviously, I'm biased because it's my life's work up until now. But yeah, nightmares are very interesting because our psyche is wanting something to come through. And a lot of the students, when they report in the Facebook group, they'll have nightmares, horrific nightmares. Doesn't mean that they're bad. It's just that that's deep, the deep, deep stuff that's coming up and out. And when your system has more containment and capacity on board, these images and these memories have a place to go. The other thing, too, that often gets connected with the nightmares, Erica, are surgical traumas. So anesthetic is very highly linked to deep, deep nightmares that often make no sense. All right, I'm going to answer a few more questions. Anna asks, what is the difference between fear, terror, and shock, and how they affect one's life of the view in the world? If they have memories of fear, terror, shock from early childhood, what happens when one hasn't felt loved and protected in the womb? What are the consequences of a mother who is not able to self-regulate? Anna, I actually already answered all these questions pretty much. I read that piece from Bessel's book. Basically, the state of a mom is going to greatly influence the regulation and security of a child. And this is a sad truth for many, but it's just the truth. So if we've had mothers, or if our mother was unwell in fear herself, which is a very common thing, especially when moms who have been in relationships, not just that are abusive, but you know, it was very common in the 50s and 60s that if you were miserable in your marriage, you stayed in it because that's what you did. So if you're creating a little being in that kind of misery and pain, that little individual is going to feel everything, and they're going to feel terror. So you ask, what's the difference between fear, terror, and shock? Fear is just biological. If someone was to knock really loudly on my door right now, it would startle me, and that would be fear. It doesn't mean that it is going to create trauma. Trauma is what would happen if someone knocked on my door and I held that inside, that fear, then it would become a traumatic event. But it's like, oh, that's just the FedEx man. It's like, okay, not a big deal. But so fear and shock are very biological. They're needed so that we can stay safe, so that we know there's danger. Terror is a little deeper in that it represents what occurs when we can't do anything about that fear. So it's helplessness, it's being under constant threat, no escape. So if we think about a fetus or baby, however you want to say it, in a mother's womb, if she is undergoing severe stress and emitting tons of adrenaline and cortisol and is in her own sense of terror and helplessness and can't get out, a child inside is essentially unable to escape, right? It can't leave that area. And because of that, it has to stay. That develops significant terror and fear in that little one. And people will often say, you know, babies will either come out totally limp because they're just shut down, or they'll come out like with punching gloves, like ready to fight, because they're just like, get me out of here. And then a lot of times when there's stress, this is why babies miscarriage, or something's not right. I mean, that's not the only reason why babies miscarriage. I want to be clear, but if there is constant stress and threat and just get me out of here, what's going to happen is the inevitable. And the thing that often people don't understand is they're like, oh, I'm fine, I'm eating well. But if there's an underlying stress physiology in that mother, the system will do what it needs to do to try to keep that baby safe or terminated, just because it can't hold on to that kind of stress physiology. So that is the difference, in my opinion, between those. Right, in premature birth too, Anne. My husband Seth was 4 weeks preemie. He knows he's processed that in utero trauma because his mother was highly stressed, very mentally unwell, and was in a relationship that she didn't want to be in. And he was like, get me out of here, right? Which was tough for him developmentally to be born so prematurely, but clearly he survived, and it was probably what his system needed to get out of that stress soup, essentially. The last question is from Anne-Christine Starbeck. It's the last one I'll answer. She'd like to know my thoughts on the psoas muscle, and that it's in the muscle the most central to our fight-flight response. And how is the psoas muscle different from the vagus nerve when it comes to storing stress? They're very different. The vagus nerve is part of the nervous system. It is the parasympathetic nervous system. The psoas muscle is a skeletal muscle, so it attaches to the front of our spine and it goes to our femur bone, our leg, and it has the function of bringing ourselves into flexion. So if you were to do a sit-up or do this, but this is the motion that a person goes into when they get frightened, when there's a fear, a shock. The system will contract in an effort to actually lengthen the spinal muscles so that then they can go into action, right? So it's like a quick length. Even though it's a contraction of the psoas, the hip, it's also allowing the spinal muscles to lengthen and get juice so that if you then want to flee, run, those muscles then have energy to go, right? So from what I've seen, the psoas muscle can definitely be on hyper alert when there's been a lot of shock trauma, a lot of threat, a lot of fear, a lot of shutdown, because a person goes into this collapse state, but they actually never come out, right? So they have trouble with even postural issues. But to me, there isn't a strong enough connection. I've worked with some people who, for instance, Pilates is one of the worst things that you can do, and you've had a lot of early trauma, a lot of shock trauma, because what it's doing is it's constantly training that muscle. Even though people will say, oh, but you're not supposed to activate the psoas muscle, a person can't differentiate that level of detail. Those muscles of the psoas, they run through the abdominal muscles and through by the perineum. So from what I've seen, a lot of people put a lot of onus on the psoas muscle. To me, it's just another muscle. It depends on the type of trauma. It depends on a person's self-care, how they've taken care of their bodies. Have they done good body movement? Do they walk? Do they not sit all day, right? Our sitting culture kind of creates this tight hip flexor quality. So it's kind of one of those questions that, or it's one of those things that we can't really say this because of this. Whereas the vagus nerve, we know that the vagus nerve is a nerve that we need, and we need it to be healthy from day one, and if it isn't, then we end up with trouble later in life, which is what basically occurs when we don't have that good early attachment. It's the vagus nerve that is actually forming really good strength and resiliency that helps the heart rate stay down. So when when part of our vagus nerve is online, I cover all this in my programs, but when the vagus nerve is really, really healthy and robust and resilient, there's a portion of it that turns on when there is stress, and it immediately downregulates the heart, right? So when a little baby learns good self-regulation via co-regulation with their caregiver, it's their vagus nerve, a portion of their vagus nerve is being grown really well. And so then when that little baby is a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old and they're off on their own and they have a stress, they can then self-regulate because that nerve has been built up really well. A child that didn't have that because mom wasn't fully there, she was too busy, she was on her phone all the time, right, not connecting. This is one of the problems right now with so many kids, is that even though mother was there, she really wasn't there. There's a difference. And so what occurs is that when these kids get older, into like kindergarten and preschool, they don't have the mechanism internally, they don't have that capacity. The nerve isn't strong enough to downregulate their heart, and then they get anxiety, right? They can't handle the stressors because they weren't taught early on. All right, Pia, one last question. You guys are great. I have chronic fatigue. Have you ever heard of this being an infection of the vagus nerve? Not directly. But I do know, based on the work I've done a lot of frequency work and my own healing. Anything can get infected. Anything can get a virus in the body, a bacteria, a duct can become infected, a part of our glands can become infected, specific parts of our bowel, GI tract can get infections or viruses. So it's possible. And I guess the question is why is it such? Why is there an infection there? And then getting the right diagnostics to be able to figure that out. The work that would probably be the best for that, Pia, is pendulum work. One of my colleagues, Verdell Jessup, her name's spelled Verdell, Verdell, she is in this group, and she does this kind of very specific private investigative work of the deep parts of the body. It's pretty awesome work if you think and you have a hunch that there might be something off in that way. So that's what I have to say about that. All right, you guys, thanks for hanging out. I've got through all the questions, so if I've missed something, I really apologize, but I'm gonna have to sign off right now. Stay engaged in this group, keep learning. I'm gonna have that healing trauma video series starting up mid-September, so keep your eye, we don't have the registration yet open for that. So be sure to keep your eyes open for that. We'll be posting that in this group. Remember that this group is really about the nervous system and talking about these things. Whatever it is you got from this talk today, let me know. Like, put in the comments what you learned, what you didn't know, what was a reinforcement that was really useful. It's good to keep the dialogue back to the nervous system. I believe in other therapies, you all know that, but I like to keep the conversation really streamlined around this so that we do the work that we need to do to get better. So yes, Healing Trauma video series will start mid-September, and then my next 12-week program starts October 17th. And in the meantime, if you haven't yet started any of my programs and you want to, the 21-day nervous system tune-up, which is curated from the 12-week course, you can start that anytime. And then what happens is, if you like my style of teaching, you like what I'm doing, if you want to join the longer program, which is really what a person needs for the developmental early trauma work to at least get that started, the 21-day cost is taken off of the 12 weeks. So it's kind of like a prerequisite investment in a way. So hope that is useful for those of you interested in doing more. All right, you guys, take really good care. We will see you later in the group. Bye for now.